Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcast, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. WBUR climate and environment correspondent Barbara Moran.
Hello, hello.
Welcome back.
Yes, good to be here.
Always a pleasure.
Oh.
So, Barb, here's the news. Here's the deal. The National Climate Assessment came out this week. Don't worry, folks. We're going to explain what that is. You went through this report to see what it can tell us about climate change here in the Northeast.
Correct.
Now, before we get into what this report is, what's in it, etc., there's a lot of climate reports coming out these days.
So many reports.
You know,
Yes.
Why is this one a big deal?
Right. So this is sort of the State of the Union for climate.
Okay.
For the United States. Okay, so every 4 years, the feds, by law, have to put out this report that says, here's what's happening in America with climate change, and here's what we're doing about it. So this is the one for this 4-year patch, right? And it's interesting because it kind of gives us a snapshot of the U.S., and it has all these, like, little chapters that break out each region.
In a sentence, what is the thesis of this report? And you can say from a national perspective.
Yeah, okay. Climate change is here. It's doing a lot of damage, but there are things we can do to mitigate the damage, to sort of help us prepare, and there's a lot of good stuff happening in that direction. So that's the nut of it, I'd say.
All right, Barb, we're gonna take it back to the Northeast. You wrote a piece breaking down some big takeaways from what you read in the report, which focus on our region. I want to start with heavy rain.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I'm talking to you about it because earlier this year, you covered the flash flooding that occurred in western Massachusetts, where a lot of farms were devastated. What did the report say about heavy rain?
Yeah, so this is interesting because a couple things about this. So the Northeast, these sort of heavy downpours are increasing more than other places in the country.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people thought that with climate change, things are going to be these like gradual changes and we get used to it. But I think what people are finding are these sort of wacky weather things happening, and they're happening one after another. And that's kind of throwing everybody off, right?
Yeah.
So an example is this summer with the farms, right? So we had bad rain, and then it was like, okay, but then we had more bad rain and like more bad rain.
Yeah.
And all these farms are like getting totally flooded. And so I went out there and talked to this one farmer, David Fisher. He has a farm in Conway, Mass. And he says it's like you can handle some rain. The ground can handle some rain, but this is like, it's out of control.
When it's already saturated and you pour water on it, we can't hold any more water. And so the river rises with an inch of rain, or, we flood with 2.5 inches of rain. I mean, that's unheard of, but it just doesn't take anything to push it over the brink.
What do you plant? Do you change what you plant or where you plant
Yeah.
and how you plant? So that's an ongoing conversation that a lot of farmers in the Northeast are having.
Okay, now what about the rising sea levels in the Northeast? What did the report say about that?
Yeah. So we are expected to see another 11 inches of sea level rise by 2050. So
Yeah.
that is a lot, right?
Not far away.
No. And so on the good side of this, if you can see one, is the Northeast is really thinking about this already. And the other thing is, so in the past, what you do if you live on the coast and there's flooding is you'd build a seawall, right? You'd like build this big gray wall to hold things back. But those don't work that well with like the increased storms and everything, and they're already starting to crumble around here. So the Northeast is leading on what they call green infrastructure, which is putting out, instead of like a wall, you have a cobble berm, which is these melon-sized rocks that you put out along the beach and that breaks up the waves, right? Or you put a salt marsh there, or you put a wetland there, or a park that can flood. And those things work a lot better, and they're also often cheaper than the seawall. So that's really good.
Okay, so that's the extreme weather, rising sea levels.
Yep.
How does all of this affect wildlife and ocean life?
Right.
Because that's a part of our livelihood here as humans,
Yes, absolutely. So the Gulf of Maine, which is this big body of water off the coast of New England, is warming very quickly, right? It's warming about 3 times faster than the global average. And this is shifting the ecosystem there in surprising ways. And one of the things that's happening is like all the cold water fish, like lobster and cod, are sort of moving away. And all these other fish are moving in, like black sea bass that are traditionally a more warm water fish.
Yeah.
And so I talked to this commercial fisherman named Bill Amaru, and he's been fishing off Cape Cod for 50 years. And he says he used to see these tropical fish once in a while. They call them strays. Like once in a while you see some lost fish. And these show up once in a while. But now...
And now we see them rather often, and they're beginning to, call this home. In fact, we even had a tarpon landed in Cotuit off of Nantucket Sound. A tarpon is truly a tropical fish. And they landed one off the south shore of the Cape this summer.
So I asked him after, I'm like, well, why don't you just switch and catch these other fish? I don't know, people eat sea bass, right? You can catch those. And he said, well, it's weird because it all depends on quotas, right? So you have these quotas of what fish you can catch, right? And they're all based on what you've caught in the past, so that the fish that they're allowed to catch are not the fish that are here now, right? So it's weird. It's all this stuff happening, and it's climate change is moving faster than the laws are moving.
The regulators can.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's not it can change, right? But it's like the climate is outpacing our ability to change. You know what I mean? So that's just it's it's a puzzle.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back with more from Barbara Moran. Did the report have any feedback on how we're doing as it relates to legislation?
Yes. Actually, I gave a big shout out to the Northeast because
Okay.
I know, right? Woo! So all the states in the Northeast have climate legislation saying we need to lower emissions. Some states more strict than others. But yeah, it's we're doing great there.
How about the indigenous communities in the region? What did the report say about how climate change is impacting them? Because that's a lot of history, right? We are on indigenous land.
So this was really interesting. The report for the first time really put indigenous communities sort of at the front and center of the report and all the way through the report. And that was really interesting and heartening, I thought. And there's a couple things, like a lot of indigenous tribes are actually coming up with their own climate plans. And they're interesting for two ways. Like one is, as you mentioned, the indigenous people in America have a long history with getting sort of shoved off their land or having their land taken away. And so the first thing in their climate plans is like, we need, autonomy over decisions about where we move, right? Where and when we have to move. So that's like number one thing. And the other thing that's really interesting is that their climate plans are very holistic. Like the Mi'kmaq tribe in Maine is especially concerned about the species that are culturally important to them, right? And so in their climate plan, they say any adaptation that we do needs to incorporate the forests and the animals, right? It's not just all about us. So they take in sort of a lot of that sort of historical, cultural knowledge and incorporate it into what's happening now with the climate and what they'll do in the future. I think that the indigenous climate plans could really be a model for the rest of the country. So that's really interesting.
Understood. Now, let's step back and talk about equity more broadly. What did the report have to say about environmental justice?
Yeah. So that's another thing that was new in this report, which is great, is that was really front and center. And talking about how the people least responsible for climate change are going to be the most affected, right? The historically disadvantaged communities, right? And the report also, gave a shout out to the Northeast for addressing this. Massachusetts in particular has done a lot to try to address this. They've come up with several plans to pay for retrofits that focus on low-income housing. They created a new job called the Undersecretary of Environmental Justice and Equity, and they put Maria Bellin Power in charge, and she was a real hardcore environmental activist in Chelsea. I talked to her about this yesterday, about putting environmental justice sort of at the center of anything we do with climate change.
The stakes are pretty high. This is about people's lives. It's about whether or not communities of color, low-income communities will be able to thrive and survive the climate crisis. On the flip side of that, it is a pretty enormous opportunity to shift the ways in which we have operated as a society.
Yeah, and that's sort of the hopeful note of all this is that we are making changes and that those changes could actually make society better. Like once we get through all of this gloom and doom, we could come out of it as a more equitable society where everybody can have the benefits of, parks and green jobs and cleaner air and cleaner water. And so that's, we're in this transition phase, but it could, in the end up good,
Yeah. That leads to my last question. What kind of influence does this report have on our policy?
See, it's funny because the report is supposed to be influence policy, but not prescribe policy. They keep saying this very carefully, right?
Yeah.
But clearly, I'm clear what the report is saying is that we need to invest in ways to lower greenhouse gases and deal with the effects of climate change. And we need to invest more and we need to do it faster. And look at all these good things that people are doing. How about we do some more of those? And why don't we keep equity centered in the center of it? So, I think for the Northeast, doing a lot of these things, the message is do more and do it faster.
Well, Barb, thank you so very much for being here. As always,
you are welcome.
It
Thank
is
you.
An absolute pleasure. That's WBUR Climate and Environment Correspondent Barbara Moran. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Comment. As always, folks, if you like what you're hearing, please go to wherever you listen to podcasts, rate and review us. We would really appreciate it. It helps us out a bunch. Thank you ahead of time. And if you want to get in touch with us, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR The Comment or send us an email at thecomment@wbur.org. I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and I will talk to you tomorrow.